Real-World Computer Programming for Kids, Step 28, Steps on Stepping and Breakpoint Bonanza, Part 4. So our app is still dealing with the last question just as it does with all the others, when it's supposed to be dealing with the last question differently, as it is the last question and is a special case. So let's break it down. What do we want it to do exactly? As soon as the last answer is selected, we want it to freeze the radio buttons, set their enabled property to false, so that the selection made sticks and cannot be changed. Also different from what is the case with other questions, do not enable the next button on selecting an answer. Also, update the percentage label, LBL percentage, to reflect whether the answer selected was correct or not. What should trigger all this to happen is the state of the freeze answer bool variable. It is set in the event handler shared by all three radio buttons. Radio button 1 _ checked changed. And that code is shown. So we need to verify that multi-choice class index is 10 so that it equals the number of questions in the CSV file when the last answer is selected. Before we tackle that by desk checking the code, do you remember when I said that taking a break can give you new eyes, so to speak, when you come back and take a fresh look at the code? After taking a break, I noticed this line of code following the if freeze answer block of code shown above. And then it shows us a line of code where the button next is being enabled as being checked. Or if the radio button is checked, that's what's causing this event to fire, then the next button becomes enabled. Do you see what's happening? If freeze answer is true, we disable button next. But then we turn right around and enable it again with that line of code, because that line of code runs whether freeze answer is true or false. So this change should solve the problem with button next being enabled after selecting the final answer. And then the updated code is shown. Do you see what's happening? By adding an else block, button next is only enabled if freeze answer is false. So that should fix that problem. But what about the radio buttons not being disabled and the percentage label not being updated? Let's desk check the code again. Looking at the code anew, and it shows a bit of code, doesn't really seem logical anymore. I don't recall what my mindset was at the time I wrote it, but if you have already answered all the questions, which is by definition the case when the if statement above equates to true, why would you then increment those two variables? You would be saying, if question answered is 10, and number of questions is also 10, then increment questions answered to 11, and increment multiple choice class index also. Why would we want to do that? Sometimes when desk checking your own code, you may feel like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as if you suffer from MPD, multiple personality disorder, and are sometimes the bad coder, Dr. Jekyll, and other times the good coder, Mr. Hyde. And it shows a picture, an old poster, for that movie of the book by Robert Louis Stevenson. That's why programmers sometimes blame mistakes in their code on their evil twin. And then the next line of code is, and it shows that, this is not necessarily wrong, but wouldn't it be more straightforward as, and it shows, instead of comparing multiple choice class index to number of questions, it compares questions answered to number of questions. And freeze answer bool variable is set based on that comparison. So I changed the code to this, to what the more sensible or logical way of making the comparison is, and that's shown. So now after the user has selected an answer with the 10th question displaying, the code in effect says, if 9 questions have already been answered and there are 10 questions, this one is the last one. And then the questions answered int variable is incremented to 10, and freeze answer is true if 10 equals the number of questions, which in this case it is. Also, the line that incremented the multiple choice class index variable has been taken out because we won't be referencing multiple choice class index anymore. So with the breakpoint on the first line, the if statement, we run it again, and Dr. Jekyll has been wreaking havoc again. It seems that the multiple choice class index variable is not holding the expected value. I stepped into a spot where it was 9, which equates to the last question, but I hadn't yet reached the last question. When you desk check your code, you are stepping through it virtually. You are stepping through it in your mind. So let's do that with the code above. I searched for every place in the code where multiple choice class index is assigned a value. There are 3 places. First, it is set to -1 when the app starts, and it shows that line of code. Then, second and third, in the update the form method, multiple choice class index is conditionally set to 0 from -1 the first time it is called, and incremented thereafter. Those lines are italicized in the code below, where multiple choice class index is assigned a value. This logic works because questions answered greater than 0 is only true after the first time through. So the first time through, the value of multiple choice class index starts at -1 and becomes 0, and then populates the form with the first set of question and candidate answers at index 0 in the list. And then subsequent times through this code, multiple choice class index is incremented, and the next set of question and candidate answers are populated onto the form, incrementing from 0 to 1, the next time from 1 to 2, etc. The app only starts once, and that first assignment, initializing the value of multiple choice class index to -1, works fine. So the problem must be in the update the form method. So I put a breakpoint on the first line in this section of the update the form method. And that part is shown where the breakpoint was put, and ran the app again. While doing that, I eventually discovered that the problem is not in the middle of the update the form method where I had put the breakpoint, but on the first line of the radio buttons, shared, checked, changed, event handler. And it shows that code, an if statement, which conditionally increments the questions answered variable. And then freeze answer is set to what we were talking about before, questions answered being compared to number of questions. Why was that the problem area? Because after answering the 9th question, and thus the value of the questions answered variable is 9, the if test equates to true, and thus increments questions answered to 10, even though only 9 questions have been answered so far, not 10. The fact that questions answered is now 10 causes freeze answer to be set to true below it, since 10 equals 10. And the 10th answer cannot be chosen because the radio buttons are frozen. They don't allow clicking. Note, something that can be confusing is the statement made in the previous paragraph, namely, since 10 equals 10. For people without programming knowledge, it's probably plain that it's saying, since 10 equals 10, and that is what I meant. But now that you know C#, you may read that as since 10 becomes 10 instead, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That is, in C#, the equal sign means becomes or is assigned or gets, whereas in C#, the double equal sign, equals, you might call it, means equals or is the same as. So the moral of that tale is that we do need to keep context in mind to determine when English is being used, human speech, and when C# is being used, a hybrid human/computer lingo. It is somewhat similar with numbers. When we name an integer variable something like questions answered, we are storing cardinal numbers in there, such as 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. But when we speak of the index into a set of numbers like that, and we use ordinal numbers like the first item, it can get confusing because the first item is at index 0, not 1. So, and a picture of the original Winnie the Pooh is shown, not the cartoon character, but the actual stuffed toy. We normally increment questions answered only after the user locks in their answer by selecting the next button, but on the last question, we want to prevent them from being able to select the next button after they have made a selection from the radio buttons. So, we need to determine where the questions answered variable is updated. It turns out that there are only 2 places. On the first line of the problematic code shown above in the radio buttons checked changed event handler and in the next button's click event. And it shows that piece of code from the next button's click event. Since we coded the radio buttons checked changed event handler to act similar to the next button's click event when on the last question, What we seem to be missing is the call to the update the form method that the latter calls. So the questions we need to ask ourselves now are, 1. Would calling the update the form method from the radio button's checked changed event handler do what we want? And 2, how can we determine that the last question is being displayed on the form when the radio button's checked changed event handler fires? So let's look at the update the form method. Look. On second thought, it seems like the only thing that method does that we also want to do in the checked changed event handler during the last question is to call the update percentage label method, and we're already doing that there. So apparently the crux of the matter, not the biscuit, which is British ease for cookie, British ease is a quaint dialect of American, is getting the radio button's checked changed event handler to cause the freeze answer variable to equate to true at the appropriate time. I changed the code to this, and then it shows a block of code with a new bit added at the beginning. Note, if you find it easier to understand that way, you can change the assignment to freeze answer to put the two variables being compared in parentheses, like so. And it shows that. Either way, with or without the parentheses works the same, but it may be more understandable to you with them. Your mileage may vary. It works pretty well now. I do have to add the nicety, gingerbreading, of having the progress bar be maxed out after the last question, rather than be left at 90% of the way across, but that's not a huge deal. So there is something else that the next button's click event handler was doing that we want to do here too, update the progress bar. Let's go ahead and fix that while we're thinking about it rather than putting it off. We add this snippet of code from the update the form method to our checked changed code, and it shows the code below it. On second thought, now that it's being called from two places, let's make a method out of it and call the method from those two places. The update the form method and the checked changed event handler are the two places where it is now being called from. Create the method like so, and it shows the code, the new method with the code in it. And then call that method from both places, rather than duplicating the same code in two spots. Replace the code in the update the form method with the call to the new method and change the checked changed event handler to be. And it shows also calling this new method, update progress bar, before it calls update percentage label. Now it acts and looks just as we expect it to, and a screenshot is shown proving that. Note, breaking the code that is used more than once out into its own separate method is sensible, because if the code ever needs to change or be refactored, you only have to do it in one place. If you duplicate code by putting it in more than one place, you may forget to update it in one place or another when it changes. This goes along with the DRY, don't repeat yourself, programming principle. We will talk more about this when we get into the next main portion of our journey on database design and usage. So as for the bigger win, not just the cosmetic win just now displayed, what was the difference in the new code that caused it to work? You might notice the only change was something added at the very beginning of the code, and it shows that code that was added. That is there because when adding a conditional breakpoint to that code, I noticed that I reached a hit count twice as soon as I was expecting to, and some Googling informed me that the radio button's checked changed event handler is called or triggered not only when a radio button is checked, but also when it is unchecked. Which makes sense when you think of the name of the event, checked changed. Not checked, but just that it changed in one way or another. So I added the code above to ignore the rest of the code if it's an uncheck that fired the handler, since we don't need to respond to radio buttons being unchecked. It's a somewhat arcane solution, yes, and once in a while it will be something like that that is causing problems. Googling is your friend. However, here we go again. When I selected the next CSV file from the list, I got this, and then it shows an error message. What do you think? Would that make a good topic for the next step on our journey into the wonderful world of coding? So do I. On that note then, until then,